Wednesday. Shaping the way we teach English. Webinar course. Shaping the way we teach English. Webinar Wednesday.
Welcome to Shaping the Way We Teach English Webinar Course 14, brought to you by the American English team. My name is Jennifer Hodgson, also known as Moderator Jenny. So welcome teachers from all around the world. Today we've seen teachers from Nicaragua and Iraq, Mexico, Oman, Kosovo, and so many other places. So a big welcome to all of you and thanks for joining us. Here you can see the Course 14 schedule, with today's webinar being the fourth webinar of Course 14. We hope you will be able to join us for the remaining webinars. And if you did miss any, you can see the recordings on the Ning site, on the American English website, and our AE YouTube channel. So just a few reminders. During the webinars, you will hear but not see the presenter. The way for you to participate is by using the chat box, as you are already doing. And this is where you can ask questions or make comments related to today's topic. We won't be able to answer everybody's question, but there is another place for you to ask questions after the session is over. Your presenter may ask you questions in the form of polls, so you'll see a multiple choice question on the screen for you to answer. And then you'll also see myself, Moderator Jenny, and Moderator Heather in the chat box to assist you. We know that sometimes you may experience technical difficulties. Unfortunately, we cannot fix individual issues, but we will let you know if we're having a global technical issue. If you do lose sound, a great way to follow along is with the caption pod that you see at the bottom of the screen. Webinar courses consist of 6 webinars, and during the course, the webinars take place every other Wednesday. Participants who attend at least 4 out of 6 webinars receive a certificate from their regional English language officer or local U.S. embassy. Only at the very end of the webinar, we will ask you to submit your attendance by typing your email address into a specific attendance box. Please do not submit it before we request it or it will not be counted. Raise your hand if you visited our Ning site. This is where you can ask the presenter additional questions after the webinar, and you can also access recordings of each webinar as well as the readings and resources. If you haven't visited the site before, you will need to register first, and your membership should be approved within 2 days. So in addition to the webinars, the American English team has many other resources for teachers and learners of English. Raise your hand if you have a mobile phone that is not a smartphone, so a phone that looks similar to the one on the screen. So we have an app for basic mobile phones that give your phone smartphone-like capabilities and also gives you free access to tons of English teaching and learning resources. You can even download all of our popular American rhythm songs that you've heard at the beginning of this webinar for free on your phone. And then if you want, you could just plug in some speakers and play the songs in your classroom. You can find many more ideas on how to use the AE app in your classroom on the American English website. So welcome to today's webinar, Practical Activities for Balanced Listening Instruction, brought to you by the American English team. Listening is a challenging skill to explicitly teach and learn, but it is one of the most essential skills for L2 students and speakers. Balanced listening instruction includes intensive and extensive listening and practice with various sub-skills and strategies. This webinar focuses on student-centered exploration of the listening process rather than comprehension as a final product. This webinar will introduce activities to develop students' listening skills in all of these areas. These activities can make your listening instruction both easier and more effective. Our presenter today, Beth Shepard, teaches ESL at the University of Oregon here in the United States. She previously taught EFL in Mexico and Peru. Her primary interest is in listening and speaking skill development. So welcome, Beth.
Hi, everyone, and thanks so much for coming to this webinar on my very favorite topic, listening instruction. Before I get started, I want to just let you know that we're going to do a few example listening activities during today's session. They're based on the TED Talk that you may have watched. It was one of the pre-webinar resources. It's also okay if you haven't watched it yet. You'll be able to follow along. But you may want a piece of paper and a pen or pencil to participate in those activities. That would be the ideal way. So if you don't have one, I'd suggest that you grab a piece of paper and something to write with right now. Also, like Jenny just said, I want to welcome you to ask me questions anytime in the chat box. Jenny and Heather will help me see some of your questions. And in addition to sharing questions, if you're hearing me describe an activity and you have another activity in mind that you do that's similar to that, please do share it. It will make a more enriching webinar experience for everyone if everyone shares their ideas. Okay. Well, welcome to Practical Activities for Balanced Listening Instruction. I love talking about listening instruction for many reasons. The first reason I love it is that listening is so important. In fact, 50% of the time we spend using our second language is time spent listening. So our students spend more time listening than they do any other skill, more than speaking, more than listening, more than reading, more than writing. In the past, listening was kind of a neglected skill. It wasn't taught enough. There wasn't necessarily a lot of research about it. But luckily, in the last 15 or 20 years, there's been more and more talk about listening. And that's a really good thing, particularly because listening is a really good way to learn language. If students have good listening skills, it enables them to learn both vocabulary, to learn grammar, to be able to speak better. And also, when students aren't good at listening, it causes them anxiety. And that anxiety can affect all their other skills. We know that students have to feel comfortable in order to be able to learn language well. Feeling anxious about listening is not unreasonable because listening is a really challenging skill. It might seem at first like listening is an easy skill or even a passive skill. But let me tell you, listening is not a passive skill. It's a really active skill. When we listen to someone speaking. And that speech that we hear is fast. It's also variable. What I mean by that is that a word that we know might sound different when someone says it, and might sound different when I say it than when my friend says it. And it also might sound different even just in different contexts with the same speaker. So speech is fast, it's variable, it's out of the listener's control. The speaker chooses the speed, chooses the words, chooses how to speak, and the listener just has to do their best to keep up. So for all those reasons, listening is challenging, and listeners have to actively create meaning from the sounds that they hear. How do they do that? Well, there's a lot of different models of listening, but one popular and useful model is the model of bottom-up and top-down processes. In bottom-up processes, listeners build from small to large. So they start by understanding, recognizing phonemes. That's the vowels and consonants, the sounds that make up language. Then they combine those phonemes together to make syllables. And they combine those syllables to make words. And they combine those words to make phrases. And finally, they combine all the phrases to be able to understand the meaning, the whole meaning of what the speaker wants to say. These skills are really easy for native speakers. They're automatic. Native speakers don't have to think much about them. In fact, usually they don't think about them at all. But for second language listeners, these skills can be really hard, particularly for students. They have a high cognitive load, which means they take a lot of attention and mental effort. So that's bottom-up processes. At the same time, we use top-down processes, and that's, of course, just the reverse. We start with the biggest level of comprehension. We use our knowledge of the world, our knowledge of basic logic, our knowledge of context, that means the situation in which we're speaking, and our knowledge of context, that means the other things that have just been said. And we use all that to build a framework for comprehension, which has a couple of different purposes. For learners in particular, top-down processes are often used to compensate for their lack of ease and speed with bottom-up processes. So when students can't understand the sounds or don't recognize the words or don't understand the grammar, they can use their world knowledge or the context to make up for what they've missed. For more advanced learners and for native speakers, top-down processes are more used to enrich the understanding of what they hear, so they can add inferences and make connections and so on. Whenever we listen, we do both of these things at the same time. It's not a matter of doing one or the other, or one and then the other. They both happen at the same time, and we need to help our learners be effective in both. So how can we do that? Well, there are two broad categories that I would put approaches to teaching listening into: the product approach and the process approach. Let me describe them each in turn. In the product approach, students listen to learn. In other words, they listen in order to find out what the speaker is saying. And listening activities always involve assessing the learner's comprehension, because the main goal of the activity is understanding the message. In order to meet that goal, teachers give pre-listening information about the topic. Sometimes they pre-teach vocabulary. Sometimes they give activities while listening that help learners understand. And then they give hints afterwards and ask questions, all to help make sure that these students can understand the message of what the speaker said. That's the product approach. In the process approach, rather than listening to learn the content, students are listening in order to learn how to listen. Teachers teach the students explicitly about listening processes and about strategies for listening. And then the students listen and listen again and make hypotheses or good guesses about what they hear and discuss their interpretations with each other. They really focus on the process of coming to understand what is said. And sometimes, actually a lot of the time, noticing something about language is part of the goal of the listening activity. So Jack C. Richards talks about listening as acquisition, not just listening as comprehension, but also listening as acquisition, as a way to learn about language. And finally, in the process approach, teachers use students' misunderstandings as a window to find out what they can do and what they still need to work on in terms of listening. John Field talks a lot about a diagnostic approach to listening, where teachers try to figure out which listening sub-skills are already easy for students and which ones aren't, and then create activities to practice the things that students most need. Okay, you might be able to guess which of these two processes I prefer. I really believe in a process approach to listening, and everything I talk about in this webinar will be within the concept of a process approach to listening. Okay. Now let's talk about balanced listening instruction. I like to think of listening activities in 4 groups, and the groups overlap, as you can see in the picture on the slide. But for me, it's useful to think of them in categories so we can make sure that we're covering all 4 of these categories and giving our students a balanced diet of different types of practice. Let me tell you just briefly what I mean by each of these categories, and then we'll go through them in much more detail afterwards. First, there's language-focused listening. And in these activities, the student's attention is put on certain specific aspects of their second language, such as vowels and consonants, or grammar, or rhythm, or intonation, things specifically related to the language. In meaning-focused listening, students work with the message in a variety of ways. This includes the old standby of comprehension questions, but it includes many other ways of working with the meaning as well. In strategy building listening, students learn techniques that can help them when listening is hard and practice using and also selecting those techniques so that they know what to do when they get into trouble with listening. And finally, in fluency building listening, students do easy listening for enjoyment and practice. Remember how I mentioned that with the bottom-up processes, they're automatic for proficient listeners? Fluency building listening means practicing listening to easy things to make those skills more automatic and improve listening skills. A balanced diet of listening practice doesn't necessarily mean that we spend exactly 25% of our time on each of these 4 categories. All it means is that we consider all 4 and consider our students' needs and then make an informed choice rather than always doing the same kind of activity, just out of habit. So I have a few poll questions for you now. Based on those brief definitions of the 4 types of listening activities, which one do you do most in your classroom? You can click your answer. Thank you. I see many people answering already. And it looks like the most common type of activity thus far is meaning-focused listening. That was also what I mostly did before I started doing a lot more research about listening recently. I think that probably throughout the world it's the most common type of listening activity, especially because comprehension questions are so popular. Let's go on to question 2. And this time I want to know, there we go, question 2. This time I want to know which of these activities you need to do more. Which kind of activity is perhaps lacking in your classroom, or you would like to emphasize it more with your students? It's interesting watching your answers come in. Looks like the most common answer so far is strategy building listening. And strategy building listening is really important. Students often struggle with listening. Listening is a hard skill, like we said, so it's great if we can teach them what to do when they're struggling. Well, I'm going to talk about each of these. I'll make sure that we have some time for strategy building listening so that we can all bring more of that to our classrooms. Let's go on with the webinar now. Here we are. Okay. Once again, I just want to emphasize that when we seek to balance the kinds of listening activities we give our students, the main overarching purpose has to be the student's ability to communicate. So balance might not mean equal time spent on activities from each of the groups. We just need to consider the groups and then meet our students' needs. Also, our main purpose, our overall purpose in teaching English is to help our students communicate. You might think that listening isn't a communicative skill, but it totally is. It's a receptive communicative skill, but when students are listening, that is part of communication. So just as in any other activity, with listening activities, it's really helpful to consider the communication goal. If there's no purpose, there's no communication purpose for the listening, then there's not really that much point in listening. And I think students are likely to be less engaged. So considering what the purpose of the listening is also really helps with motivation. Okay, so let's start talking more about language-focused listening. I'm still trying to watch for questions in the chat box, and I also want to say that as I present these activities, remember, feel free to add your own. That will enrich all of our experience. Also, before I get started, I just want to let you know that this is the TED Talk we'll be talking about. Some of you have already watched it. For those of you who haven't. Also, the practice activities we do will be aimed at upper intermediate to advanced levels so that we can do them together. But almost everything can be adapted for low-level learners. You just might use a different text or certainly different topics and do things a little differently, but the same activity types can still be used for every level. Language-focused listening. When I talk about language, I mean all levels of language. So starting from the smallest, right? Phonemes, vowels and consonants, syllables, For each level, I want to give an example. So here we have phonemes that spell out for the next 30 days. We can see that we have a lot of different vowels and consonants there, as well as 6 syllables that those add up to. And our learners need to be able to distinguish different phonemes from each other and recognize syllables. The next level is words and chunks. So here we have, for the next 30 days, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 words, but we really kind of have 2 chunks. We don't tend to put empty spaces in between words. That's one of the things that makes listening challenging. So words end up glomming together into chunks like this, like for the next. Then we have the syntax level. That's grammar, right? So for the next 30 days, we have a preposition and an article, an adjective, maybe a noun phrase. Students need to be able to understand the grammar as they listen. And then we have the level of intonation group. For the next 30 days has 2 main stresses, and it has an intonation contour that sounds like for the next 30 days. And that's important for listening comprehension as well. So whenever I talk about different kinds of language-focused listening activities, they can apply to all these levels of language. And here are the language-focused listening activities I'm going to talk about. I'm going to look at each of these in turn. Let's start with dictation. I want to emphasize that this is different from the old-fashioned kind of dictation that was like a spelling test. In this kind of dictation, spelling and punctuation don't matter because the point, the communication goal, is for students to listen and comprehend. The writing is just to show that they understood. Also, students should practice listening at a normal speaking speed. So yes, normal speaking speed is faster than normal writing speed. But if students have understood, they should be able to remember and write. So the key is using short, simple sentences, or even just phrases or single words. So we adjust the level of the dictation by adjusting the length and the complexity of the sentence or phrase, and not by slowing down. Dictations should be quick without too many items, usually just 3 or 4, maybe 5 sentences or phrases, and they can have several purposes. One purpose is to preview keywords. So before listening, students can become familiar with a few tricky words from the text that they're going to hear. This is commonly done, but usually teachers pre-teach vocabulary by presenting the words on the board or on a piece of paper. I prefer to dictate them instead, and preferably dictate them in context, in the context of a short, simple sentence. And then afterwards, I discuss the meaning of the words. That way students initially learn them by recognizing how they sound when spoken, which is what they need when they're listening. Another purpose for dictation is to practice understanding difficult sounds. Maybe your students have trouble hearing the difference between and or between and or between and It depends on their first language. Whatever that is, you know what your students' challenges are, and you can create dictations that help them practice these distinctions. So, and you can also combine this one with the previewing purpose by choosing words that include those challenging sounds that will appear in the listening text they're about to hear. Okay, another purpose is to review a vocabulary list. This could also be before a listening text. It could also be after it, or totally separate from listening to a longer recording. When students have learned a list of vocabulary words, I think it's really helpful and important for them to also learn how those words sound and how those words sound in the context of a sentence, so that they can learn to understand the spoken form and not just the written form. So I think that dictating short sentences that include vocabulary words can be a regular part of vocabulary instruction. Finally, dictation can focus on students' problem areas. Listening has a lot of sub-skills like recognizing sounds, finding boundaries between words, catching those hard to hear grammar words like to, at, his, her, making a good guess at unknown words, distinguishing questions from statements. Dictations can help you figure out what of all of those different listening sub-skills are hard for your students, because if you dictate and they're not able to do it, that must be what's hard. And then they can help you zero in and really practice those things that are hard for students. You can design dictations that focus on whatever aspects your students need. let's do an example dictation. Here's where you need your pen and your paper. I'm going to dictate 4 sentences to you. I'll say each one twice, and you write them down, and then I'll talk about the purpose for each of these sentences. Are you ready? Number 1. He really loved biking to work. He really loved biking to work. Number 2. He wrote a pretty bad book. He wrote a pretty bad book. Number 3. Crazy challenges help him remember exactly. Crazy challenges help him remember exactly. Number 4. Morgan Spurlock isn't a philosopher. Morgan Spurlock isn't a philosopher. Okay, so you recognize the themes of these 4 sentences relate to the TED Talk if you watched it, but this would be something to do before watching the TED Talk. Here are the sentences so you can check your answers. And what are the purposes of each of these sentences? Well, for number 1, I tried to put in r and l sounds, especially really loved. Those are the key words. And that's practice for students who have trouble recognizing and distinguishing those sounds when they listen. Number 2 is kind of similar, but for p and b sounds. So they would be for different sets of students. Number 3 uses some important phrases from the talk, from the TED Talk, to help students get ready to understand them. So crazy challenges and remember exactly are key phrases from the TED Talk. Not only that, they have some kind of tricky consonant blends like cr and exactly. And speaking of exactly, they also have some reduction, meaning they have some, exactly is a word that's spelled with a T, but not usually pronounced with a T. Exactly is what I say. The T tends to fall out of it. So that might be something to bring to students' attention if appropriate, depending on their level. For number 4, I used a word that students probably had never heard before, Morgan Spurlock. It's the name of a famous person in the United States who makes documentary movies about, his most famous one, it was about McDonald's food called Super Size Me. So it gives students a chance to try to write down an unknown name. I actually think that dictating unknown words can be a useful activity to do occasionally with students because they learn to try to write things down and maybe try to get close enough to be able to look it up so that they can, that's a useful strategy for them to be able to use later. And then number 4 allows us to talk about who Morgan Spurlock is, give some background information that will help students understand the TED Talk, and in particular help them get one of the jokes that the speaker tells. Okay, so those were our examples for dictation. Let's talk about repetition now. When I talk about repetition activities, I simply mean having students shadow the speaker. I mean repeat after what the speaker says, whether that speaker is a recording or another student or the teacher or whoever. You might think of this as a speaking activity, and it is, but it's also definitely a listening activity. Students will only be able to repeat accurately what they understand. They might be able to repeat 2 or 3 or 4 syllables without understanding, but as the chunk gets a little longer, the understanding is what makes them able to repeat it. If you'll bear with me, I'd love to give you an example based on a language you don't know. It's a Native American language called Chinagwawa. So please go ahead in your own rooms where you are and repeat after me, even though I can't hear you. First, I'll say just a few syllables, and I expect you'll be able to repeat after me. So repeat, Tiki Chagu. Tiki Chagu. Probably you could repeat that, no problem. Now I'm going to say a much longer phrase in this language, and try and see if you can repeat that. Na Tiki Chagu, but Halgas na Mukagwa. Na Tiki Chagu, but Halgas na Mukagwa. It's still not very long, but I bet it was a lot harder for you to repeat since you didn't understand it. On the other hand, if I said, I wanted to come, but I couldn't make it, because you understand English, you can repeat that much, no problem. That's what that means. Chinook means I wanted to come, but I couldn't make it. Okay, so I have a few notes. Based on what I just said, it's necessary to understand a sentence in order to repeat it. And so we adjust the level for our repetition activities, just like for our dictations, by changing the length and complexity of the phrases to be repeated, not by slowing down or using an unnatural rhythm. Wherever the repetition breaks down, then we can use that information to know what level of phrase or even which aspects of the phrase are difficult for our students and are areas for them to improve their listening and, of course, their speaking as well. So here's some examples for repetition in English. So please, like I said before, repeat after me, even though I can't hear you. Here, first we'll do some phrases. Number 1, subtract a habit. Subtract a habit. Number 2, remember exactly. Remember exactly. Number 3, crazy challenges. Crazy challenges. All of these phrases use challenging sounds to discriminate, and if they're done before the listening, also prepare students for those phrases that they might encounter in there. You can also repeat longer sentences, and here my focus is on the rhythm and intonation used by the speaker and preparing students to understand why that rhythm and intonation is used. So again, repeat after me. I'll just do number 4 and then number 5. Now is my book the next great American novel? Now is my book the next great American novel? Number 5. No, I wrote it in a month. It's awful. No, I wrote it in a month. It's awful. So here we could have students repeat, we could check their understanding, and we can also talk about what that particular rhythm and intonation means in that context. These I would probably do after listening to the TED Talk. Okay, let's move on from repetition to anticipation. In anticipation activities, we stop mid-sentence and have students guess what word or sound they'll hear next. We might stop speaking, we might pause a video, that doesn't matter. Depending on where we stop, we can make these activities focus on sounds or word endings or grammar, whatever we need them to focus on. And we can have students answer individually, preferably in writing so that everyone gets to think about it, or by discussing with their groups. Here's a few examples. We might say, try it for the next 30. And if students already know the title of the talk or have already heard the talk, they'll know that the next word is days. If they don't, they'll probably still guess some kind of time frame, 30 minutes, 30 seconds, 30 whatever, probably 30 years. Okay, number 2, subtract a habit from. And then imagine students talking with their group and figuring out that that word must be from. Helps them be ready to recognize that phrase in context. And number 3, the third anticipation sentence. Think about something and we can have students guess what comes next. The next word in the listening is always. Think about something you've always wanted to do. That's one good option. It could also be never. It could also be a past participle. But that's pretty much it. Those are the 3 most likely possibilities. So that's worth discussing with students. Okay, let's move on to the next type of language-focused listening activity, language spotting. In this, we have students listen selectively for certain aspects of language, which could be sounds, words, intonation, grammar, whatever it is they need to work on. Let's do a few examples. So for the first one, we would tell students to raise their hand every time they hear the word 30. So what we're going to do, we're going to listen to the first little bit of the speech, the TED Talk that I mentioned before. And you can raise your hand every time or make a check mark on your paper or whatever you want to each time you hear the word 30. Here we go.
A few years ago, I felt like I was stuck in a rut. So I decided to follow in the footsteps of the great American philosopher, Morgan Spurlock, and try something new for 30 days. The idea is actually pretty simple. Think about something you've always wanted to add to your life and try it for the next 30 days. It turns out 30 days is just about the right amount of time to add a new habit or subtract a habit, like watching the news, from your life.
Okay, did you hear the word 33 times? Here they are. We're going to do another language spotting activity now. Oh, I do want to say this might be a good activity to do first, just to bring students' attention to the main point of this, right? Now let's say we tell our students, write down every word you hear that begins with. Let's listen again to that same part of the speech, and go ahead on your paper, write down each word you hear that begins with. But you don't need to write it in the chat box, just on your paper.
A few years ago, I felt like I was stuck in a rut. So I decided to follow in the footsteps of the great American philosopher, Morgan Spurlock, and try something new for 30 days. The idea is actually pretty simple. Think about something you've always wanted to add to your life and try it for the next 30 days. It turns out 30 days is just about the right amount of time to add a new habit or subtract a habit, like watching the news, from your life.
Okay, let's take a look at my list and see if it's the same as your list. We had few follow footsteps philosopher for from. I like that it included philosopher, which isn't spelled with an F, because that's an important thing for students to notice, that spelling is not always the same thing as sound. We could also have considered using the total number of F sounds, which was a few more. There were some words that had F in the middle or at the end. And of course, let's note that philosopher has F, but of, even though it's spelled with F, doesn't have a F sound. It has a sound. So that's language spotting on the basis of sound. Here's another example. We can ask students to write down the past tense verbs that they hear. So if you'd like to play along, use your paper and pencil to write down all the past tense verbs that you hear. We're going to listen to the next part of the speech now.
There's a few things that I learned while doing these 30-day challenges. The first was, instead of the months flying by forgotten, the time was much more memorable. This was part of a challenge I did to take a picture every day for a month, and I remember exactly where I was and what I was doing that day. I also noticed that as I started to do more and harder 30-day challenges, my self-confidence grew. I went from desk-dwelling computer nerd to the kind of guy who bikes to work for fun. Even last year, I ended up hiking up Mount Kilimanjaro, the highest mountain in Africa. I would never have been that adventurous before I started my 30-day challenges.
Okay, so that clip had some present tense verbs and some past tense verbs. You can see here's my list of past tense verbs. It can also lend itself to a part of a grammar lesson, right? We might ask students, which past tense verb is the most common? You say was, right? And that might be interesting to notice. And we can work on regular past tense verbs and irregular past tense verbs. So that's a grammar-based language spotting activity. I got one more for you. This time I want you to circle the words or the ideas that Matt Cutts wants to emphasize. Of course, you don't have a transcript in front of you. You might choose to write down the words that Matt Cutts wants to emphasize, or just notice them in your mind.
There's a few things that I learned while doing these 30-day challenges. The first was, instead of the months flying by forgotten, the time was much more memorable. This was part of a challenge I did to take a picture every day for a month, and I remember exactly where I was and what I was doing that day. I also noticed that as I started to do more and harder 30-day challenges, my self-confidence grew. I went from desk-dwelling computer nerd to the kind of guy who bikes to work for fun. Even last year, I ended up hiking up Mount Kilimanjaro, the highest mountain in Africa. I would never have been that adventurous before I started my 30-day challenges.
Okay, so if I was doing this activity with students, I would provide them with a transcript for that paragraph and have them circle the words. Then we can talk about how the speaker emphasizes something like, I would never have been that adventurous before I started my 30-day challenges. And that emphasis on never is important to notice for students. It's important for them to learn how to figure out what's important for the speaker. Okay, so those were several examples of language spotting. We can also talk about transcript correction activities. And I do also want to add that you can make transcripts for listening, but you can also often find them online. And TED Talks are one example of a resource online where there's always a transcript available that you can just copy and paste. So one kind of transcript activity is where students fill in the blanks on a transcript. This is one of the most common listening activities done throughout the world. What I want to add or specify about it is that teachers should choose a specific language focus when choosing the blanks. Don't choose them randomly, but think about what students need to work on, whether it's discriminating certain sounds, certain aspects of grammar, certain vocabulary words. Choose a language focus and remove those words, or remove the words next to those words, depending on what your focus is. In addition to transcript completion, we can also have more of a true transcript correction activity, where students find and correct errors that the teacher has put into the transcript. And these errors can involve any of the language levels we've been discussing. So I'd love to show you two examples of this. These are, again, examples for you to play along. So for transcript completion, I've inserted blanks at the ends of the words. So here it's a focus on word endings, kind of a grammatical focus. Most of these blanks will be filled, but some of them will be left empty. So if you want, on your paper, write down the word endings that you hear and write an X or a slash or whatever you want for the blanks that will remain empty. Let's listen to this little paragraph.
There's a few things that I learned while doing these 30-day challenges. The first was, instead of the months flying by forgotten, the time was much more memorable.
Okay, for students, I would need to play that more than once, but let me go ahead and show you the ideas, the answers here. You can see I've filled in the blanks. I've left some unfilled. I really like to add blanks that don't get filled, because that keeps students paying attention and focused. Let's look at an example of transcript correction now. Here I have a transcript of the next part of the speech, and I have inserted 7 errors. Why don't you see if you can find them while we listen?
I also figured out that if you really want something badly enough, you can do anything for 30 days. Have you ever wanted to write a novel? Every November, tens of thousands of people try to write their own 50,000-word novel from scratch in 30 days. It turns out, all you have to do is write 1,667 words a day for a month. So I did. By the way, the secret is not to go to sleep until you've written your words for the day. You might be sleep deprived, but you'll finish your novel.
Okay, some of the mistakes I've added are word mistakes. I put a synonym or a different word or I even changed the meaning. Some of them are grammar mistakes. Did you find 7? It's pretty hard to do just listening once. In fact, I want to listen again and I want to show you an example of how we can make it easier. We can highlight the errors. So now I've shown you exactly where the errors are, except I've forgotten one, haven't I? There's one bonus error in there. So listen again, and this time see if you can write down on your paper the correction for those errors.
I also figured out that if you really want something badly enough, you can do anything for 30 days. Have you ever wanted to write a novel? Every November, tens of thousands of people try to write their own 50,000-word novel from scratch in 30 days. It turns out, all you have to do is write 1,667 words a day for a month. So I did. By the way, the secret is not to go to sleep until you've written your words for the day. You might be sleep deprived, but you'll finish your novel.
This time when I listened, I heard 2 more errors that I forgot to highlight. Writing should have been to write, and write should have been have written. So there's 2 more grammatical errors in there as well. Plenty. All right. Let's continue on to the last type of language-focused listening activity, and that's tiny questions. When I say tiny questions, what I mean is that students hear a very brief listening text, and then students get a question that in order to answer the question, they have to use the grammar or word choices of what they heard. These can be hard to create or hard to find, but actually very useful to students. Here's an example. Students might hear, a few years ago, I felt like I was stuck in a rut. That's the first sentence of this TED Talk we've been using. And I might ask them first, stuck in a what? What is that? What does that idiom mean? So that's the first tiny question. Do you know what stuck in a rut means? Stuck in a rut means stuck in a routine, doing the same thing over and over, not doing anything new. Yes, Sandra, that's right. Okay. The second tiny question that I want to bring up after hearing this would be, was he definitely stuck in a rut? And now we can have students discuss with each other again. How would I know from what I heard? He said, I felt like I was stuck in a rut. Oh, so maybe he wasn't definitely. Maybe he just felt like he was. So these are just examples of the kind of tiny questions you can ask based on a single sentence of listening. So we talked a lot about language-focused listening. Let's move on to the other types of listening now so we can keep a balance in our webinar as well. The second category is meaning-focused listening instruction. I think this is the most commonly done both in my context and based on the poll, also in a lot of your contexts. So again, please feel free to share your own ideas for variations or different activities in each category as we go along. You can do that in the chat box. When I talk about meaning, just like with the many levels of language, there's also many levels of meaning. Meaning might mean the main ideas of a text or the supporting points. It might mean the details or just the numbers. It also might mean the inferences that listeners can draw beyond what the speaker explicitly said, or it might even mean the listener's reactions to what they hear. Regardless of all of these levels, or in order to address all of these levels, students can do 3 different categories of meaning-focused listening activities, and I'm going to talk about each of these in turn. First, let's talk about reconstructing content. When I have students do activities for content reconstruction, I always invite them to take notes. Could you please raise your hand if you also ask your students to take notes when they listen? I see that a lot of you do. Lots of hands are up. Wonderful. Are your students good at taking notes? I know that mine aren't very good at it. And so I need to scaffold their note-taking. That's why I said scaffolding notes here. Scaffolding is a structure that's built temporarily to help people reach something, and then it's taken down again when it's not needed. So when we're talking about teaching, scaffolding means helping students be able to do something that later we want them to be able to do by themselves. Scaffolding for note-taking can mean a chart or a graphic organizer so that students can simply fill in specific information at specific times. It might mean a discussion of the text sections so that students can really figure out the structure and figure out how to organize their notes. Or it might even just mean making sure that students know the purpose of their notes so that they can take good notes for that purpose. I have a couple examples here, and I also want to invite you to share your ways of scaffolding note-taking in the chat box. Here's a graphic organizer. I've already put in the challenges that Matt Cutts talks about in the course of his speech. So I'm just asking students to read the challenge and then listen for that challenge and listen for the results of that challenge and fill in only the right-hand side of the chart. So that's a graphic organizer that would help students successfully take notes. Another example is talking about the sections of the text. So let's say I have my students listen to the Matt Cutts talk, that TED Talk one time, and then I say, so if we were to make 3 chapters or 3 sections for this listening, what would they be? And we might talk about it together and realize that the speaker first talks about what he did, then talks about the results of that, and finally gives advice to the listeners. We might draw an imaginary note paper on the board and set them up to organize their notes into 3 sections. Will you please raise your hand if you provide scaffolding for your students' note-taking in your instruction? Great, I see see a growing and growing list of people who already do that. Wonderful. Once we have students taking scaffolded notes, they need a purpose for their notes. Notes aren't a purpose in and of themselves, but they do help students with activities that involve reconstructing content. Let me give you some examples of activities. One is to create a summary of what they heard, or at lower levels or with harder texts relative to the student's level, they might correct a summary that the teacher has made with some errors, or complete a summary where the teacher has inserted some blanks, whether those blanks might stand for words or for ideas or for sentences, or maybe the teacher has written the beginning of the summary and the students write the end, and so on. So that summary might be written, but they also might use their notes to paraphrase what they heard by speaking. They might prepare an oral presentation in which they paraphrase what they heard. Students also might follow the instructions that they heard using their notes. Students might create comprehension questions based on what they heard. And also, finally, students might answer comprehension questions. That most famous listening activity, comprehension questions, does find a place in our webinar today. Okay, so those are our activities for reconstructing content. Now let's talk about manipulating content. When I'm saying manipulating content, I mean students think about how the meaning of what they hear is put together and how it could be different. So students listen with a purpose. They listen maybe in order to put the pieces in order, or to match theme titles to parts. By that I mean, well, like I said before, that the TED Talk that we heard has 3 parts. The speaker tells what he did, the speaker tells the results, and the speaker gives advice. So I might ask students which part fits with which of those 3 titles. We can ask students to tell back what they heard in reverse order, or to finish or change the story of what they heard, or to compare content with each other in a jigsaw activity. I'll tell a little bit more about those in the examples to follow. Here's a sequencing example. I've just taken the 5 challenges that the speaker did and put them in out of order. Ask students to write numbers as they listen to put the pieces back in order. It's an example of content manipulation, a pretty easy example. I might ask students to find themes. For example, to raise their hand when they hear that switch from describing, which he does about the first 3/4 of the talk, to giving advice at the end of the talk. Or I might have students do a jigsaw activity. For example, I might have half the class listen to one talk about setting goals and making your life better, and half the class listen to another talk about setting goals and making your life better. And then I might have them share information with each other in order to compare the talks. A jigsaw activity is called that because each student has a piece of the puzzle, and they have to put those pieces together in order to complete their task. Okay, those are some examples for manipulating content. Now let's talk about meaning-focused listening in terms of responding to content. Here, students listen in order to bring their own ideas in relating to what they heard and understood. That might mean sharing their initial reactions right after listening. It might mean comparing what they heard to their personal experience, or evaluating, or discussing, or debating the speaker's opinion. Is he or she correct? What do they think? They also might answer questions that the speaker left open, or even play the role of the speaker in a role play. And finally, one activity I really like to do is to have my students create interview questions based on the speaker's ideas, and then interview each other. Here's a few example questions for a response section of meaning-focused listening. Notice that I ask students if they agree with the speaker, and then I ask them how they know what they heard. How do they know they're right about what the speaker's idea is? Well, so I didn't ask if they agree first. I asked what the speaker's opinion was. Then I ask if they agree, and for reasons. And then I ask them to apply the content to their own life. There's many other types of questions we can use. And these questions sound like they're at quite a high level, but remember, we could be using a text about food or about favorite colors, and then asking students whether they agree with the speaker or what the speaker's opinion is. Okay, so that finishes meaning-focused listening for us. Let's go on to strategy building listening, the one that you all said you needed the most. First, we need to define strategies. When I say strategies, I mean techniques that effective listeners use in challenging situations when it's hard to hear or hard to understand. You can read a lot about strategies, and often people categorize them into three groups. Cognitive strategies relate to how we think while we're listening. Metacognitive strategies relate to how we think about listening or how we think about thinking, how we think about trying to succeed. And socio-affective strategies are about how we encourage ourselves or work together with friends or ask for help. Most importantly, strategies really vary from student to student and from activity to activity. So we can't say to students, here is a strategy, strategy X. Now please always use strategy X. It won't work for everybody and it won't work all the time. But what we do need to do is teach our students a variety of strategies and give them some experience in trying those strategies out so they can figure out what works for them and how to choose which strategies to apply. When I talk about strategy activities, I'm going to put them in four categories: prediction and planning, monitoring, problem solving, and collaboration. So let's start talking about the first one of those. For prediction and planning activities, I would suggest first showing the title of what they're going to hear, or telling the title of what they're going to hear, or perhaps also showing or playing the first few sentences, and then having students do a variety of possible activities. One is simply asking them to talk with their group and say, let's say that we have the TED Talk that we watched. It's called Try Something New for 30 Days. And I might say to the students, what do you think this talk will be about? Just give them 2 or 3 minutes to predict the content. I might also ask them to predict the structure, especially at higher levels. I might say, what parts do you think this talk will have? And finally, and probably this is the simplest one, I might ask students to predict what words they will hear. After all that prediction, students can do a little planning. They can talk with each other about how they will listen. We'll talk about some more problem-solving strategies later on, but I would suggest that here students, once they've heard about those different strategies, now they say, well, which strategies should I use here if it gets hard? Should I ignore words I don't know? Should I try to make myself confident? We'll talk more about those strategies in a minute. The next category of strategy activities is monitoring. Sometimes students don't really know how well they're understanding. They need to learn to monitor their own comprehension. And they also need to learn how to recognize when what they thought they heard turns out to be wrong. So we need to teach students to make hypotheses or guesses about what they hear, and then not to forget to keep checking those hypotheses. Sometimes when students mishear a word, it gives them a wrong idea about the sentence, and they will carry forward that wrong idea for a long time. What they need to learn to do is to be willing to let go of wrong ideas if they turn out to be wrong. So we can discuss with students the importance of checking their understanding as they go along. We could also do activities like asking the students to use hand signals while they listen. For example, we might have them use thumbs up if they are understanding well, thumbs maybe sideways if they're not quite sure, and thumbs down when they recognize that they're not understanding very well. This will build the student's own awareness and also give the teacher some good information. And if the teacher wants, she can pause the video, either maybe just right when the thumbs go down or at set points, to ask small groups to talk together and help each other, to summarize what they've heard so far, talk about how much they've understood, ask each other questions, and plan for how they're going to succeed in the next part of the listening. Right, and try to avoid leading them to our own understanding as teachers. Let the students do it. It will be much more useful for them in the long run. Okay, the next category is problem solving. I think this is the real meat of strategy building instruction. I'm going to give a little list of possible tools and solutions, possible problem-solving strategies. Once we've talked about it a little bit, we can remind students by having them list possible challenges and possible solutions, such as focusing on keywords, ignoring unknown words, using context to understand and make a good guess, verifying after making guesses. And here's a good socio-affective strategy. Take a deep breath, forget what you didn't hear and listen to what's being said now. Sometimes that's really hard for students. I've seen them tune out if they don't understand for a little while. Those are just a few suggested possible strategies for students to use for problem solving. And one way to teach students how to apply them is to pause the video or pause whatever listening activity students are doing, and the teacher thinks aloud, oh, I didn't understand a word there. I'm not sure what that sentence means. It could mean this or it could mean that. What can I do now? So the teacher can share how he or she would approach the listening. And also, I think this is a really important step, students can have listening journals where they reflect on what strategies they used and how well they worked. The last category of strategy building listening ideas are collaborative strategies. Specifically, I want to just explain to you the process approach as described by Larry Vandergrift in his 2004 article. You'll be able to find the information about this article on my last slide. I have a list of references. The process approach has these 5 stages. It does involve listening 3 times. In the first stage, students plan and predict. They say what they think they'll hear, what words they think it will include, what parts they think it will include. They usually do this in groups, talking with each other. And then now they listen. In step 2, the first time they listen is the first verification stage. Here they're checking, was I right, what I predicted? And also probably noting down whatever else they heard, but it teaches them to have an idea and check if it's right, and then note down additional information. And after that first verification stage, they get back together with their groups and talk about what they heard. Notice especially if they have disagreements. Someone thought he said this, and someone else thought he said that. So they can decide what they especially need to pay attention to on the second listening, which is the second verification stage. They listen, check those points of disagreement, make corrections, write down any extra information they can catch. And now the whole class has a discussion led by the teacher where they try to reconstruct the main ideas and the main points of the text. And also where they reflect together on how students got to that point. What strategies did they use? How were they able to understand? Finally, in step 4, we have the final verification stage where they listen one more time, just to check what they've made a summary or a brief outline of the listening at this point so they can check it for accuracy and see what they missed. And then step 5 is a reflection stage where they write in a journal or talk with their groups about the strategies they used and what their goals are for the next listening. So this is a real good strategic process to go through sometimes with listening. It's okay to use a short text so there's time to listen to it 3 times and time for plenty of discussion among students, where the teacher really takes a back seat and listens and guides, but doesn't give the answers or give hints to force students to come to the correct answers. Okay, so that covers strategy building listening. Let's talk about fluency building a little bit. And as always, please feel free to share your ideas in the comment box. Listening fluency is the ability to hear and understand without significant effort. Remember how I told you way back at the beginning when we talked about bottom-up listening, that the ability to hear sounds and translate that into vowels, consonants, syllables, words, phrases, sentences, that's really automatic for proficient listeners. And that's what listening fluency is, being able to automatically understand what you hear. Fluency building listening instruction means learners are completing an easy task with a high level of performance. And there's a wonderful quote by Renania and Farrell. Well, first of all, they say learners receive a lot of comprehensible and enjoyable input. But there's another quote from them that I really love where they say learners practice comprehension instead of practicing incomprehension. When we play learners listening texts at a hard level, at that I+1 level that some of you are mentioning in the chat box, they're working hard, they're not understanding everything the first time, they keep working with it, eventually they do understand it. They've really practiced struggling. I think it's good to give listeners also a chance to practice listening without struggling. And that's what fluency building listening is for. Does it sound fun to you? Do you do easy activities in your class? I think it's a lot of fun. I love seeing my students' faces when they listen and understand and feel successful. I have a variety of activities that I can use to help students be able to do this. Let me go through them one by one as I've been doing. So the first way to give students enjoyable and easy listening practice is with graded listening texts. That means the texts, the recordings, or the speaking that they listen to is set to their level. The vocabulary is mostly known, the grammar is mostly known. One easy way to do this is for the teacher to tell stories. I remember in one of my language classes when I was younger, every Friday the teacher told us stories from her life. And we looked forward to that, and all we had to do was listen and enjoy listening. And of course, she was able to adjust the level of her speaking to our level. So that was perfect. Also, when students listen to other students, there's at least a degree to which the listening is set to their level. The vocabulary and grammar should be familiar. And then maybe most commonly, we can use graded audio that's published, whether as part of a textbook, as part of a graded reader. Those are books designed for students to do reading fluency development, but they often come with a CD. Or they can use online recordings, for example, from podcasts or online listening labs. For all of these, though, we should take text that's one level lower than our learner's level, so that it truly is easy and enjoyable for them. Another way to make listening easier, instead of grading the text, is just to repeat it. Actually, I read a really interesting research article by Chang and Reed, and again, you can find the citation at the end of the talk, where they used a variety of different techniques to make listening easier, but by far the most successful one was simply repeating the listening. And many of the activities we've described today already do involve listening, already do involve repeating the listening. And that means repeating can be a really easy way to add a strand of fluency building listening to your instruction. Whenever you've already finished a listening activity, whether that was meaning focused or language focused or whatever else, you can just play it one more time and tell the students, just close your eyes and listen. Remember how hard this was for you at first? How you can understand it. Notice how it feels to listen and understand. Right? Just play it that one more time, and that can really help learners get to have that fluency-based experience. The next way of adding fluency building listening is with supported listening. By that, I mean that listeners get some way of making it easier. So they're listening to a text that might be a little bit hard for them, hopefully not super hard, and they get some support, like, for example, reading along. They might read a story while that story is read to them. Or they might read the subtitles while they watch a movie or while they watch something like a TED Talk. Or it doesn't have to be reading. They could also follow along with pictures, watch the gestures of the speaker, even just being able to see the speaker. A video recording as opposed to an audio recording, being able to see the speaker's face and mouth can help listeners a lot. So those are ways that can help a bit. I see an interesting question. Someone is asking, what happens if someone cannot hear very well? It's difficult for them to understand a listening activity. And that's absolutely true. If someone is hard of hearing, if their ears aren't very good, then they need all the help they can get to be able to hear well. For example, sitting up front or a raised volume. And then with that help, they should be able to learn and learn to listen better and better. But it may also be that for those people, listening is not the primary method by which they're going to learn English. They may also focus on other skills more. Okay, let's move on to the next type of fluency building listening, and that's what I call topic and genre flooding. What I mean by that is a lot of listening on the same topic or in the same genre, because if students are familiar with what they hear, then they probably know the vocabulary, or at least more of it, and they understand how people usually speak about these things, and they even know some of the information that's going to be shared. So they're more able to compensate for some information if they miss it. We can do topic flooding in several ways. We might just take a theme and make lessons all about that theme, not just for one lesson, but for a week or 2 weeks or a month, a nice long unit. For example, we might talk about animals for a month, or we might talk about Halloween for a few weeks. Another way to provide fluency building listening through topic and genre flooding is by using ongoing series. So they always have the same structure. Maybe it's an ongoing soap opera that's written for English language learners, or maybe we always listen to documentaries from the same television series so that learners get used to the structure of that television series and how it works. And finally, we can just focus on topics that are familiar to the students, things that they like to talk about, things that they like to read and listen about, because then they're more likely to know the vocabulary and know how to talk about those things and understand them more easily. And finally, we have independent listening. As I'm sure you very well know, class time is limited. We can only do so much listening during class, but if students listen independently outside of class, they can usually hear a greater quantity of easy and interesting material. There's a lot of things available online. There are podcasts for English language learners. There's Voice of America and other broadcasts that are for English language learners. And songs and videos, for example, YouTube videos or popular songs that the students like can be a great source of independent listening practice. And we can have students keep a diary or fill in a chart to show that they've done their independent listening practice at home or in the language lab. All right, so we've talked about all 4 types of listening instruction, all 4 types of activities. Here are our 4 categories again. I hope I've been able to share some activities with you that were new and maybe applicable to your teaching situations. Would you mind raising your hand if you heard an idea that you might be able to apply in your classroom? Great, wonderful to see it. Remember, when we say balanced listening instruction, we mean that we aren't forgetting any of these 4 categories, and that we're paying attention to see why and how our students struggle with listening, exactly what is challenging for them, and what parts of listening are challenging for them, and then add activities as appropriate, drawing from any of these 4 categories as needed. Which is wonderful in principle, but it brings us to one more challenge, and that's finding time for listening instruction. We have lots of good activities. Our students really need to be able to listen. Our instructional time is so small compared to the needs of our students. I'd like to ask you another poll question about the instructional time you have for listening. How much time do you teach your students total? So how much time do you see them per week? Watching your answers come in, well, it looks like you're pretty evenly. There's a wide variety of amounts of time that you all teach in this group. So far, it looks like the most common answer is 3 to 5 hours a week, maybe an hour every day, or a class period that's a little less than an hour every day. Okay, let's go to the more important question. How much time can you dedicate to explicit listening activities and listening instruction? I see your answers coming in. I see 2 answers being the most popular. 1 to 2 hours a week is the most. And then the next most is less than 1 hour a week. Yeah, so it's a real challenge, isn't it? To find time for everything we need to do, and especially to find time for listening. Let's go back to the slides. I just want to talk a little bit about how we can find time for listening and instruction. I think the best and most important way is to integrate and emphasize listening instruction when we're teaching other skills. Yes, we want to explicitly and only teach listening sometimes, but we can't do it that much. But we can also make sure there's a listening component when we teach vocabulary, grammar, speaking, reading, writing, and we can give a little bit of emphasis to that listening that happens anyway. For example, when we teach vocabulary, we can use dictation to teach the vocabulary words. We can, and this is the important principle, we can just make sure that our students recognize the spoken form of their vocabulary words, not just the written form. And the spoken form in context, not just the spoken form in isolation. So for example, what about the word can't? All our students know the word can't. And when I say that word by itself, can't, you can hear how it sounds. But what if I say, I can't go? It doesn't say I can't go. in context, right? You don't even hear the T, I can't go. So we can teach our students that words might sound different in context and then be sure that they have a chance to hear their vocabulary in context. When we're teaching grammar, well, grammar is very closely tied to listening, especially since a lot of the grammar is carried on those little function words, the small ones that are usually unstressed and hard to hear, like to and my and word endings. Those are mostly unstressed. So when we're working on a grammar point, we can have students listen to sentences containing that grammar. It might be a dictation, or we might have them complete a transcript, or give them tiny questions, or just have them listen a little bit with their eyes closed after teaching them about a grammar point. Of course, it's really easy to integrate listening with speaking. Whenever students speak, listening is involved because the other students also listen. But a lot of times we don't make that explicit or emphasized. Maybe we can maybe while one student speaks, we can give the other students an explicit listening task to do while their classmate speaks. They might be required to take notes or listen in order to formulate follow-up questions. And then for reading and writing, we can have students read aloud and other students listen to it, or the teacher can read aloud and other students can listen. It's important to read silently sometimes too, but reading along while listening can really help strengthen those connections between the sounds and the spellings. And it can be helpful for students listening as well. And then students can read their own writing and listen to someone else reading their own writing in order to correct their writing or in order to hear their voice in another way. And this can be done in pairs so that the maximum number of students can participate in both speaking and listening. So my main point here is that we have lots of listening activities and they're important, and it's really important to include them in our instruction. But when we don't have time, we don't need to always do a 20-minute listening activity. Sometimes adding 1, 2, or 3 minutes onto another activity can provide really good listening practice. So here are the references for you. These are some things that you can listen to. Most of them are things you have to read. Unfortunately, you can't listen to them unless you have someone read them to you. But these are some more articles and books about listening that I find really useful. We have a few minutes, so if you have any questions you'd like to ask me in the chat box, anything that you may have asked before and I didn't notice at the time, I'd be happy to answer your questions right now. Reading the chat box. Thanks for your participation, everyone. I had a great time talking to you today. Someone asked what skills should be practiced more and why. And I have to just say, I think it depends on the context. For the most part, I think that, like you guys said in the poll, the meaning-focused activities are done a lot. They're done plenty. Although we could probably increase the variety of our meaning-focused activities as well. Do those language-focused activities that our students need. Teach how to find the right balance. Someone asked about any activity suggestions for very young learners. Very young learners. For them, I think listening is especially important because they don't read and write yet. They're not ready to speak. We have to very young learners too. They need to move their bodies. So let's see, we can have meaning-focused activities in which they follow the directions, point to the thing that they're being asked to point to, and so on. We can have language-focused activities where we ask them to raise their hand when they hear a specific word, like for word red or whatever. Fluency building listening is probably enjoy. We can combine that with meaning-focused listening by having hand motions for the songs. I think listening is really key for very young learners. I have a few other questions. Besides the American English site, Graciela asks, where can we get more listening material to download? Well, it depends on your student's level. I'm familiar with quite a few online sites. One is Randall's Cyber Listening Lab. Another, if you type EFL podcast into your search engine, you'll probably get several sites that you can look at and assess, consider. What else? For upper levels, there's a variety of speeches and different people sharing nonfiction ideas and documentary movies. There's songs that you can find on YouTube and other videos on YouTube. So I would go to the internet or make use of CDs that come with textbooks, including textbooks that aren't the one that you use in your class. See what other questions we have. Good videos to use in class. 10 are good videos to use in class. It depends on the level. I see Diogo from Bolivia wrote about sources of good videos. If I haven't already answered your question, Diogo, feel free to tell me the level of your students, and perhaps we'll continue that discussion on the Ning. Ivan from Nicaragua says, can we download the articles from a website? Several of these articles on the references are books, so they're not downloadable, although some of them have some chapters on Google Books. You can check there. Some of these articles, some of the ones that are articles may be available on Google Scholar. Some of them may not. And then you might need to look into a library or a university or a school that you're affiliated with and see if they have those articles. Let's see, we had Mabarane from Senegal asking, what do you think about the difference between American and British English when teaching listening? Great point. I think it's important from the intermediate level on that students listen to a wide variety of different accents. American accents, British accents, Australian accents, Singapore accents, various non-native speaker accents. They're all important, and that's part of our students' development as world English speakers, to learn to listen to different accents. I do feel that at the elementary level of instruction, it's best to stick to accents that are near to the teacher's accent, or perhaps choose only American or only British and stick to that. So for example, if you're teaching American English, I might stick to American English recordings at the elementary level and then bring in more variety later. Okay, well, thanks for all your great questions. Let's continue this discussion at the Ning, and I can also make up a list of links and post it for you at the Ning. So I'll put some sources for online listening on the Ning, and also if I can find some of the articles on my reference list as links that are openly available, I'll try to post those on the Ning as well. Oh, I see one more question. Do you agree with speaking slowly to beginners? Yes, sometimes. How about that for an answer? We want our learners to understand us. So we have to speak slowly. We can't speak just like we do to a native speaker when we're speaking to beginners. But at the same time, we don't want to use a really unnatural speech rhythm. So I think the more important changes that we make to our language when we speak to beginners have to do with the vocabulary and grammar that we choose, keeping it simple, and inserting pauses. Saying a phrase at a normal speed and then pausing is better than slowing down all of the words and pausing between all of the words. So I agree with speaking slowly to beginners with those caveats that I just said. And I also think that occasionally then we let our beginners also listen to faster speech. We set an easy task to go with that hard listening. Well, we're almost out of time. Once again, you all had wonderful questions. It was really wonderful talking with you today. So I'll sign off now. Thanks again, and I'll see you on the Ning. Here's your moderators.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Beth, for that excellent presentation that not only emphasized the importance of the process approach to listening, but provided us all with a wide array of practical activities to balance our listening instruction. So please join me in giving Beth a big